Hey guys, so I'm working my way through the advanced bots on chess.com and somebody actually requested a video on how to beat Isabel bot. So here goes. This is a game that I just played earlier on and it's a bit wild. Isabel seems to be quite a tricky customer. So she starts with the Reti opening, knight to f3, and I immediately go into a reverse London, bring my bishop out. So this is going to be the King's Indian. I'm going to have the bishop there, and the idea is to castle kingside. Now the knight comes around to attack my bishop. I drop the bishop back, and now I have g4. And e5, kicking the knight, kick the knight again, and the knight goes all the way back home to g1. So far so good. Develop the knight to f5. We have e3, to bring out my other knight. She kicks the knight, and I maneuver it round towards the queen side. Now we have the knight coming out to c3, attacking this pawn, and I bring my knight back around to defend the pawn. Queen comes out, and now c6. So we've got a nice light squared pawn structure here. Now h4 and f6. I just want to make sure that my bishop's got a way to escape. So I push f6. And now the rook comes up to h2. Okay, I bring my knight forwards. She hits the bishop, bishop retreats, and now bishop to f5. Move my knight back, and now we have a pawn push, and I decide to capture here because this pawn is actually undefended. So I take, and now a4. Push my g pawn, so we've now locked off this pawn here, which is currently undefended until the bishop moves. Now the queen comes out, kind of attacking the knight here, so at this point I could have maybe grabbed that bishop, but instead I just developed my final minor piece, and now we have b4. So quite a messy board on Isabel's side. Now I bring my knight out to attack the queen, queen moves, I defend my knight with the bishop, and now rook to a3. So both rooks have moved, which means white is not going to be able to castle in this game at all. I put my queen on e7, maybe targeting this pawn if that knight moves at some point. Queen retreats now. Now I put my knight in here, hitting the rook, and the knight now comes back. Really not sure why she didn't just move the rook there, but I grabbed the rook, and so I'm now up an exchange and also a pawn. So now I solidify my pawns with b6, knight comes back around, and now I castle kingside. So I've got a fairly robust structure here. This pawn isn't going to cause me too much trouble anytime soon. I do have to be aware of this pawn moving, but I can meet that again with c5, so that's not an immediate concern. Attack the bishop now with the knight, bishop retreats. Now I attack her rook, rook retreats. Now I offer an exchange of bishops. She doesn't go for that, but I do. I swap off the bishops. Okay, so now we are fairly comfortable, I would say. I've got a reasonable pawn structure here going on. Quite happy on the king side. So my idea now is by pushing this rook up, maybe I'll think about doubling up my rooks and attacking up the f-file. Okay, we have knight to d4, and I swap off the knights, mess up her pawns, and now double up my rooks. Rook comes back to add a third defender to this, so I can't capture now, because I've got only two attackers, and we actually have the king as the final defender. So I throw my queen into the mix, but even so, I've got three attackers, three defenders. It doesn't actually make sense for me to start exchanging now. We have c3, and now I bring my knight around. So my knight isn't really doing anything there as part of the attack. I'd love to get it into here if I could. Queen comes around, knight attacks queen, queen comes to there, and we swap off queens. All right, so she's now got quite a fractured pawn set up. King is not castled, it's still in the middle of the board. I've got my rooks lined up here, and I'm up the exchange. So knight comes to here, obviously eyeing up f3 with a fork on the king and rook. She doesn't have that, so king moves forward, getting out of the range of the knight, and the rook moves as well. But my knight's got a nice little outpost here for now. So now I push my rook up, then targeting this pawn on e5, pawn advances, and there we go, I grab the pawn. So now I'm 4 points up in material, double up my rooks again, and now we have a bit of a pawn break on the A file, not too concerned. Move my knight now around, which attacks the rook. Rook moves, and I put my rook there, and we're kind of okay. So my pawns are making nice progress up the board here, and Isabel's king is definitely looking weak. So bishop moves, bring my knight around again, and again. So in case pawn takes, I've got knight takes, or even rook takes, quite comfortable there. And this bishop is now looking very bad, can't go to any of these squares, and it's going to have a tough time getting into the game. It's also blocked in by its own pawn there. So I bring my knight around now looking at this pawn, which means that this rook is now pretty much tied to this pawn on h6. I offer an exchange of rooks. Isabel doesn't go for that. So I just push up, get a bit more space, dropped a pawn here, but I grab this pawn back, and now we're manoeuvring again, and now the bishop swaps itself off for a pawn. Go figure. Okay, so now I am up a full rook. We've both got 4 pawns, so I attack the knight, knight moves, play h5, just shoring up my pawns. Got to be a bit careful now about the pawns on the queen side of the board. So we have a pawn push, takes, and now I offer an exchange of rooks. So I move my knight to d6, preventing this idea. The computer didn't like this, and now we have a pawn fork. So first thing we do, swap off rooks. Now I move my knight away to capture this pawn, because I figure that the game is actually technically won, and I can even give up my rook at this point with my extra pawn on the king side of the board. And now I decide to push up. She pushes, I grab that pawn, and now she's going to find it hard to capture this pawn with only a knight. Knight moves around. Computer didn't like this move either, but hey, with check. And now my knight is defending and protecting the g1 square. So king moves, I queen, we have an exchange of knights, and now all I need to do is get rid of this pawn, convert this pawn, and the game is won. This is actually a 100 move game. So I bring my knight round, grabs the pawn. There's nothing that Isabel can do now to prevent this pawn from going all the way. So I move my king in front of the pawn. This is very important. I don't want her king to get in front of the pawn, so now we have a queen, and it's a relatively straightforward maneuver. You've got to be careful always about stalemates, of course. Move my queen right out of the way, just a waiting move with a knight, and now I get opposition with the kings, so that they are 2 squares apart in line. King moves to here, queen to there, and wherever the king goes now, there's only 2 squares, it's going to be checkmate on the next move. Queen to b7, checkmate. So definitely a tricky bot. And I think that if you want to train playing very kind of creative moves, then Isabel would be a good one to practice against. 1600, maybe that's right, I don't know, but it did feel like there were a couple of blunders in there, which you maybe not expect from a 1600 player, but there you go. So that is how to beat the Isabel bot on chess.com. Relatively comfortable in the end, but you really do have to be on your toes in order to get one past this particular bot. But I hope you've enjoyed that. Please subscribe to Chess Bootcamp if you haven't subscribed, and I'll see you soon.